right, welcome everybody. This is George Leoniak here at New Geometry. Slightly different look today. Today I've got a long-term friend and mentor here, Paul Rezendes, and Paul is real significant in my journey, not as a geometer, but as a wildlife tracker. And many of you who watch my videos may not know that my background is in wildlife tracking, and it taught me a lot about observation, and Paul was super influential in helping me to see more, understand more. He's really big into self-inquiry as well. And we're going to be discussing today's topics are going to be about consciousness, awakening, openness, creative process. You can learn more about Paul. He wrote a book called The Wild Within, as well as Tracking in the Art of Seeing. So welcome, Paul. It's great to have you, and I'm super excited to be doing this with you.
Me too.
It's kind of a blend between our two worlds. Paul's an amazing photographer, videographer, drone photography, all these things. And you never stop learning, it seems like, right?
Right. You gotta keep that brain,
The neuroplasticity, right?
Right, gotta keep that going.
You definitely have that. I'm always inspired when Paul's always learning things. I was really curious in some of this conversation is like, what is at your age, you always continue to learn. How does that relate to something to do with openness or consciousness or something with the learning process?
Yeah, to me, if one stays open, the lotus continues to open. And you continue to just realize different things that they just come into view that you haven't seen before. And age has not stopped it, just comes into that open window.
Yeah, that's amazing because, just a few years ago, you learned drone flight photography, become one of the certified Massachusetts people to do this. So just a select few people learning that. And I always thought that being openness and kind of allowing the information to come in, less resistance in the learning process, seeing something you haven't seen, creativity.
Yeah, and a lot of it for me, not only is it related to the technology and how fast technology is changing and how you have to keep up with that, but mostly for me, the value is in understanding human consciousness and life, basically.
So where did
who we are and who we are not, and things have changed for me and how I see that. Since we last talked, it's probably changed quite a bit, actually. Since we done that last video on what it means to be awake.
Right. Yes, the viewers that don't know that, Paul and I have a whole series called The Mindful Trackers, and another video we did, What Does It Mean to Be Awake? So I'm curious to hear more about kind of the evolution of how your relationship to the material related to the consciousness is continuing to unfold for you.
Yeah, so I think if we jump directly into that, I don't know how your audience is going to relate to how we speak, the language we use. It's going to seem out of context somehow.
Well, I don't know. We're trying something new here, right? Yeah. So we just have to roll with that. And remember, a lot of the audience that I'm engaged in, many people gravitate to the sacred geometry images because they're in some sort of process of self-inquiry or meditation or exploring consciousness or awakening and things like that. Yeah. So I don't think the language may be too far off than you think. So we can just dive into that if you want.
One of the more significant changes for me in the most recent past, since we talked, actually, since we done that other video, is you can probably relate to my talking about how in life, when we observe life, when we observe the thought process, our feelings, there's our experiences, there's all these experiences and thought processes that are coming and going, but they're coming and going in something that doesn't appear to be coming and going. There's something there that seems like a background that's not changing as things are changing, right? And I've seen things like that for decades, actually. And when we look at that background, it seems to look more like awareness, and an experiencing is coming and going in that awareness, but the awareness is sort of aloof, it is not touched by what's happening within it. Mm-hmm. That's the way it seemed at first. But the more you stay open to that, what happens, at least what happened for me and seemingly other people, is that you realize after a while that what is coming and going is what is not coming and going. Mm. So what is not coming and going can't in any way be separated from the coming and going. And it points back to the Buddhist saying, form is formless and formlessness is form. Mm-hmm. They're both arising at the same time. They're InterBeing. There's no way we can separate them. And I just find it difficult these days to say that the awareness is not coming and going or not changing, because at the same time it is this change. It is the impermanence. The permanent and the impermanence, the form and the formless, are appearing together. But it's like a paradox. Like life is a paradox. In the mind, the thought system can't really go there. It can't understand that. And it needs a deeper sense of intelligence to actually see that that's happening. The intellect needs to divide to understand, and there needs to be seeing the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, how do you see something like that when you are what's seeing it?
Right.
So, you're not separate from that movement, so you can't step out of that to see it if you are already moving as that.
Right.
So I mean, that is the big crux. I mean, that's the big paradox of what you're saying. So it's just amazing to me that you continue to have deeper insights into this, because we've talked about this for years, 24 years, since you introduced this, and you were well related with this much before I even knew you, 20 years before that. So how do you continue to get deeper and deeper insights into this? Is the epiphany of that always something, it always must be something new in the moment rather than it being rote. It has to be alive in the moment for that awareness to come in. It can't be a set up mode of discussion. It can't be something already ready to rehash or rephrase. It's got to be alive in the moment to see that. It's the only place you can see it, right?
Right. It has to be spontaneous. We don't it doesn't seem to me we have control over that. That's the illusion, right? And one thing that I usually try to point to, which I think is a good metaphor, is that, for instance, when you get lost in thought, right? I think we can all relate to that, right? So you're lost in thought. You might be walking in a beautiful pine forest, and all of a sudden you're just lost in thought. You're not paying attention anymore to the birds in the canopy or the smells or the sounds. But the thing is, what's really interesting is you didn't choose to be lost in thought. That just spontaneously happened, right? When all of a sudden there's a realization that you're lost in thought, you didn't decide to have the realization either. It wasn't predetermined by you. It was spontaneous. But that realization is its own action without an actor, who we think we're the actor, right? Yeah. But there's no actor in that realization. That realization is immediate change. And that's what the Taoists call Wei Wu Wei, action without an actor, or action without action. It can be interpreted both ways. And two, I think what happens in human consciousness, and we're taking big leaps here, is that people don't understand that they're really lost in thought. They're lost with the notion that they're the thinker of the thought. That the thinker has volition over the thought process, has control over the thought process, has free will, free choice, and all that, when that may not be true at all. We're lost in those concepts, like being lost in thought. There can be an awakening, which we talked about in the previous video that we did, where that awakening can be immediate change, and you wake up to the fact that you're lost as the thinker of the thought. You're lost as that identification. You bought into it, you believe it, it is who you are. And that's very tightly hold on to.
Yeah. Hey, you can't think your way out of that.
You can't.
And you can't take control of and saying, I discovered that I was lost in thought either, right?
Right.
Something else has to come in and generate that insight that isn't going to be thought itself, right?
Yeah, that's
what you're saying?
Yeah. So just like when you woke up, you were walking in the forest lost in thought, and there was an awakening to that. It's not that the thinker woke up, but there was an awakening that the thinker didn't have anything to do with. And the same thing can happen to the illusion that we are thinking the thoughts. We're identified with the thinker that has control that it may not have. There can be an awakening that comes in that has nothing to do with the thinker.
Yeah, the words that are coming to me is the conditioned and the unconditioned. You know, everything of the thinker is going to be coming from the conditioned response or the conditioned way of moving about. But when an unconditional, spontaneous insight emerges into that is outside of the framework of the conditioning, that somehow is informing the conditioned process at that moment, right? But that's back to the same two sides dilemma, right?
Yeah, I'm
something
glad
outside
you,
of
yes,
that, right?
absolutely. Good insight, George. So yeah, that's right. So what's interesting about all this and what's so hard to understand, I'm even hesitating to go into it, is that the thinker of the thought the whole universe, can we go into the fact, which seems like a fact to me, that the whole universe is showing up as the thinker of the thought. The thinker of the thought, or any thought for that matter, let's just think of it as one thought for a minute. Because the thinker is made up of thought. That's how it seems to me anyway. But let's just look at one thought. We think of it as my thought, right? I'm having that thought. And nobody knows what thought I'm having. I'm the only one that's aware of that thought. So it seems separate, right? How can that thought exist without everything that has ever happened? Who you are showing up as a human being, is that separate from the light, from the sun, from the planets revolving, from the earth, from the planet, the air, all the beings and all your relatives that have become before you are here now as this, as you, right? Now, people listening to this, certain thoughts are going to come up because they're listening to it. So are those thoughts separate from who they are, who their ancestors are, and their relationship with this video? Those thoughts can't be separated. It is co-arising. It is into-being. Every thought that comes into being is into being with everything else. It can't be a thing by itself. If you pull on that thought, you start to pull on it, you find it connected to the whole universe. Right? I don't understand how it can't be. You know? So, too, the self is the whole culture. It doesn't seem to me I chose. Like, I used to identify as being a Portuguese Catholic American, right? That was or a badass biker, right? Yeah. I didn't choose that. It doesn't seem to me that I chose that. It was programmed into me by my whole culture, where I was born.
Well, maybe that's because you're not operating with consciousness at that point in the way we talk about right? You're part of a conditioned stream of movement. You're being programmed, like you say, in a conditioned environment to become these things. So I think when people say they wake up to that movement of their conditioning process that turned them into the badass Portuguese biker. How did I become this? You know, like
Right.
I never knew that I would have. How did I become that? I never knew that my path would bring me there, because you get so wrapped up into the identification of being all those things, you think that's who you are.
Right.
You know, like that's your whole world and who you are and what you become, how you see everything through those lenses.
Yeah.
So that's all in the conditioned process. It's your whole series of thoughts that constructed that
Right.
identification process with that self that you
Right.
think you are.
So if that conditioned process moves to change itself, it brings itself with the process. It can't just jump out of itself.
So you're saying you wake up to that and you're going to make a change to be something else. You're saying that there's still momentum there with the process of how to reinvent oneself in a new way, or
Well, that can happen,
yeah.
right? But like, for instance, as you know, I used to be the leader of a notorious motorcycle gang. And I really had this identified with this persona of being a macho guy.
Mm-hmm.
But at one point, and you know, there was still a lot of conditioning there at that time. And I was in my 20s. And, but there was a seeing at some point that the only reason why I was this macho tough guy was because I was afraid not to be. Mm-hmm. And the whole undercurrent of machismo was fear. And all these guys that I was hanging out with were also afraid not to be tough guys.
Yeah.
Well, that's what gave them security. So there was a realization there that was spontaneous and came from nowhere. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that I decided to have.
Yeah.
It wasn't my decision to see that, but there was a seeing that happening.
Yeah.
But because I identified as the thinker of the thought, it was me who saw mm-hmm. that fallacy, right?
Right.
It was me that saw that it was fear underneath that machismo. And that's, so we don't see that there's something else acting in our lives often. There's an intelligence and an awakeness there that reveals things to us, but we think we're doing it. Mm-hmm. We identify with that realization. And that just keeps the notion of control in place.
Mm-hmm. And then what's it
and
look like?
It keeps the identity in place.
Yeah, you had that insight and you saw into it, but then what does it look like when that's not, that mechanism isn't playing out like that? Let's say you have an insight into that, there is no control of it. Does it just move through and change your relationship to it, or is there no you anymore in regards to
Well,
that?
well, at that point, there was just a realization of the game of machismo,
Yeah.
and I just couldn't play it anymore.
Yeah.
You know, so I looked other places for a different identification,
Right.
something else to hang my hat on,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah, that
But
process.
I needed a new hat to put on at that point.
Yeah.
But so there's no big change.
So what is the big change? What is a big change? You know, when you don't move with the re-identification process, but you're still moving with life. I mean, you're still moving and doing different things and learning new skills or learning, you know, you're still doing that, right?
Yeah.
But what's the difference then when insight comes in and it doesn't get co-opted as the thinker that had the insight?
In order for that to happen, it seems like there has to be a realization that the thinker is fictitious in the sense that it doesn't have the volition it thinks it has. And when there's that realization, the belief in that persona is gone. The belief is gone. So a lot of identifications will fall away. I mean, right now in this world, it seems to me that human beings are deeply suffering. And it's all because of an identification crisis. You know, Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, all these things we identify with, American, Russian, Ukrainian, black, white. Those identifications get very rigid, and they divide people. So there's all these divisions. Our country right now is so divided because of those types of divisions. And when the person wakes up to all that, when there's an awakening to that, and it's not co-opted by a different identification, then I think we're going to be living in a much nicer world.
So does the energy of the participation in that just dissipate over time? Is that what you're saying? You know, the identity. You know, if you woke up from the gang leader and you just stop putting energy into that, it's just going to dissipate. Although it may move to another identification process. So you got to become intimate with the how the energy moves from one identity to another. You know?
Yeah, and it's not that, and I know you understand this, George, it's not that you have to be vigilant about making sure you don't get caught up in another identification that's already creating the problem and the division.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be this and I should be something else.
Yeah.
So there's identification there at work too. So can we see that? Is there a seeing that without intention, but a spontaneous, alive seeing, and that seeing is its own change. It just nullifies what is coming into view.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's where the openness plays out. You know, you can't be open. You can't try to be more open.
Right.
If you're receptive to the openness, the opportunity to see that may happen and change the flow without trying to set up some sort of restraints or constriction or
Exactly.
around the watch. You become the watcher then, right? And then you try to circumvent anything like that. That's just more of the control,
Right.
right?
Then that's not openness
Right,
anymore.
right.
Right. If I'm trying to be open, then I'm not.
Right. So, then someone would say, well, how do I be open? So how do you initiate that possibility to be open, right? Like
Yeah.
what can one do to do that?
Yeah. We need to understand what's asking the question.
Right, but I mean, so if you say, they can't move this way, I can't move that way, okay, I could be open. All right, so we'll say, how can I be open, right? How can
Right.
I make that happen?
Yeah. That's just like saying, how can I become humble? What do I do to become humble? What do I do to become open? Like, that's almost asking, like, how do I achieve humility? How do I achieve openness? Can one achieve humility? You see what I'm saying? If it's achieved, is it humility anymore?
Well, I think it's always going to be alive in the moment. I think that's the only place you can ever discover whether if not you of taking a humble approach, let's say, right? Not that you achieved it,
Right.
it just becomes apparent in the situation, I guess, where the opportunity arises. It's not predefined.
Right.
I guess that's how it would kind of work out. I guess that only happens because openness is moving within the action,
Yeah.
and it presents itself as being humble in that moment, right?
Yeah.
Rather than I'm going to be more humble, I'll do these things. It just presents itself and
Right.
it allows it to be.
So, what can happen maybe is, like the thinker of the thought, the identification with that, it's not only identifying with thinking the thoughts, that I have control over the thoughts. It's also, I'm also aware. I'm the observer. I'm observing things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's all in the same structure. So if there's a seeing that the thinker of the thought as the observer is thought observing thought. So if the thinker thinks it's observing, and the thinker is really an idea, the identification is observing thought. As it does that, it divides itself. But it doesn't see that. It can't see that it's dividing itself. It can't see the whole picture. So all of a sudden, if there's a realization outside that division, it's not really outside, but we're stuck with words here. So if there's a seeing outside with quotation marks outside that division, and that division is put in its place, and there's a seeing that is totally blind. It can't see a thing. Then there's humility. There's humility there now that I can't see. I don't see anything, right? There's a realization there. There's also, as undeniable as the blindness is, the seeing also is undeniable. And there's nobody seeing it. It is the seeing. That's what's understood in that moment, that there is a seeing happening that is bringing light to the blindness. It's revealing the blindness, and that's humility that nobody did, right? Nobody made an effort. It was what people would call grace, right? So we get into this place, George, where, people want to know, well, what do I do then? So, and we get stuck there, and so the only thing I can feel like I can do, some people will give people advice, and they'll say, well, spend time in nature. Spend time just being in nature and watching what is actually happening. And that will help you get away from thought. So people say meditate, and people say you can make yourself vulnerable. To me, the best way to deal with all this is just pointing at the actual problem. And that's what we're doing now. We're trying to point to the actual problem in the hope that that deep understanding and intelligence and openness or awareness that permeates all of us is going to understand. That's going to come to the forefront and reveal what we're talking about to someone else.
And could that be the forefront of, I think we used to describe it as there's a flip-flop in someone's awareness, or
Right.
that becomes the primary way of being at that point, is that the thinker thought loop that you're describing is kind of spinning in its own endless loop that it can never get out of. The only way for that to ever have any insight or adjustment to the broken loop there is this other process, but that's what your true nature is, let's just say. That's the true nature. The other is the self-identification, thinker of thought loop.
Right. So there's an intelligence there that the thinker of the thought has co-opted as its own. It thinks it's the intelligence. Thought is the operating intelligence. Until intelligence comes in and reveals that it isn't.
Now, can you be that intelligence without co-opting and saying you're that intelligence? You know what I mean? Like,
well,
is there a way to, not a way, but
well,
is there a transition that may take place for someone that you just, the wheel, the hamster wheel has spun its revolutions. It's just slowly spinning. That's the thinker of thought loop, right?
Yep.
And then you just move with that intelligence, this other intelligence you're describing, but never claiming it for yourself. It's always, do you know what I mean?
Right. There's no identification with it.
Right.
But that does happen for some people.
I know, that's the big pitfall, right, of that.
Right. So and it's sometimes a cultural thing. So a lot of the times, a metaphor that's used is you're not the small s self.
Mm-hmm.
You're the capital S self,
Yeah.
right? And when there's a realization that you're really not the small S self, and that belief system falls away, one can, at that point, identify with the awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And the metaphor that's used is the screen and the movie in the screen, TV screen, and the movie in the TV screen. You're the screen, not the movie. Whatever's happening in the movie doesn't affect the screen. The screen is unaffected. If there's joy, if there's horror, the screen's unaffected. That's your true self. That's how it's portrayed in a lot of this non-dual
Yeah.
talk. So if you wake up under those ideas, or if that's constantly put on you when there's an awakening, there can be an identification with awareness. Mm-hmm. And to me, there's still an identification there. It's a beautiful place to be, and people can stay there, and there still can be more peace in one's life by identifying with that awareness and realizing that's the true nature of everybody. So it's not a dead end or anything. There is an awakening there. But that can fall away too. And one can realize that, like, when that awareness is embodied, that awareness is being this person. It's being this person. And it has feelings, it has emotions. It's a human being, right? And sometimes I think the Buddhists refer to that embodiment as the Bodhisattva, the one who has embodied enlightenment, has compassion for other human beings. So now, what's going on so we're not denying anymore when that awareness is embodied. We're not denying anymore that there is suffering in the world. Mm-hmm. And we are affected by that. We are affected by what everybody else is doing. We're not separate from that. Yes, we're all different. And this is something to me that is very interesting. We all have different personalities, right? Different fingerprints. Mm-hmm. And we have, because of our differences, we all have different perspectives. Those different perspectives can't be what they are without all the other different perspectives. In other words, you can't have difference without difference. Mm-hmm. It's like a tree growing in the forest is what it is only because of all the trees around it. Mm-hmm. It's growing in a certain way because there's other trees around it. It is different because of all the other trees and their differences. Mm-hmm. So difference is, the whole universe is showing up as these differences. These differences are already whole. Mm-hmm. They're not, it's a paradox in the sense that you can't have difference without wholeness. They're both appearing at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so So as awareness is embodied, it opens the door to this deeper and deeper understanding of wholeness and interconnectedness, and the fact that life is this paradox we're all living.
Yeah, I think
without identification.
I think that's probably what Bohm was after with the wholeness in the implicate order. You know, seeing all the connections within that whole picture and having the order that's within that, very subtle relationships between these differences, all part of the whole. The unfoldment and enfoldment back in.
Right, and I did get to know him.
Yeah.
He had that guy really had an effect on my life. And there's one thing he says that always, at first didn't ring true for me, is that wholeness and separateness are arising together. A particle and space are appearing together. You can't have a particle without space, and you can't have space without a particle.
This is how you started off what you were describing, the two separation. Again, you can't, two sides of the same coin. You can't separate one from the other. I mean, this is what he was bringing up through that example, huh?
Right. So I keep, there's no way I can separate anymore even awareness from form or the formless from form. They're not separate, And the beauty in that, though, is that as we are changed, as by everything that's happening is appearing as these words are also bringing change. So what we do is the whole universe showing up as what we do, but it is the whole universe creating change at the same time as it looks through the different perspectives and different beings. It continuously moves in different ways.
Now, when you're moving with that type of consciousness, let's say, that's got to look totally different than all the moving parts that are out there with people who are not moving. They're moving with that consciousness, unaware of it. They're in this other loop, right?
They're identified and dividing themselves from that wholeness.
Right, so then you have a totally different world.
You have a totally different world.
Than one that is moving with you're not identifying with that movement of consciousness, but you're in the flow with that.
So that's where we're seeing the human suffering come in, is from the division.
Right.
There's an insistence on division where there's wholeness, and it's in conflict. Human beings are in conflict because of these divisions. I don't know if we could stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to stop whenever you are. I think we covered a lot of ground. I think it all was cohesive and followed continuous.
Hopefully.
I think it was cohesive. It seemed like you circled back around to where you started there at the end. So, I mean, as you can see, we could probably keep going on and on,
keep going,
but,
George.
You will get into a loop there, even because you can't go where the words are pointing anyway into conversation.
Correct.
So you're just saying the same thing in different ways and articulating it different. But to anybody who's listening, maybe those different ways of hearing it, you may hear it different one way than another, and maybe there's some different insight there. So A totally different video than I've done for everything else on the channel. So I really appreciate you being here. I hope that your audience members will appreciate it too. You can check out Paul. He's got his Paul Rezendes, right? The YouTube channel that you just started up, right? Is
Yeah.
it just Paul Rezendes? Yeah. So all his contact information, of course, will be in the notes. And I'm super thankful that you joined me today, Paul, and thankful for the viewers too checking this out. So maybe we'll come back and do another one as we see if there's some questions or comments. So drop them into the discussion there, and we'll look forward to the next video.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
Cool, George.
All right.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.